So today I'm going to show you some results from the Paleo-Enso reconstruction in continental environments from the northern Andes of Colombia. So as most of you know, the Enso is the main source of climate variability at interannual timescales in the northern tropics. It has a strong wet, dry impact and imprint in the hydroclimatology of the region, with great implications for natural systems and society, of course. So superimposed on this intertropical convergence zone that's driving the annual variability in climate, we have this strong, very clear signature of Enso. So we will be focusing on that brown area on top of the map. So we are going to be talking about a very interesting area because it's complex in terms of climate, not only because of Enso, but there's a coincidence of many climatic factors. So we have the Caribbean and the Atlantic influence in the north, and from the western side we have the Pacific, which you see it as a very dark blue area in the map, and this very high precipitation regimes is one of the wettest places on Earth, with more than 18 meters of precipitation in some years, is actually related to this Chocó low-level jet. As you can see here, as you can see here, that's deflecting and bringing a lot of humidity around at 5 degrees north. And then it encounters the Andes Cordillera and it leaves all the humidity there. And I have to say that Chocó low-level jet is modulated by Enso. So we, in the end up with an area very humid, but it's very much influenced by that Pacific oscillation. So what we have here is, I have also to say that it's complex in terms of topography, because the Andes Cordillera in that part of South America is splitting into 3 different branches. So we have the Western Cordillera here, which is not that high, and the Central Cordillera, which is here. So we will be talking about, and usually that what happens in normal years is that the trade winds will meet or interact with the Chocó low-level jet, bringing a lot of humidity, and most of the humidity stays on the western side of the Western Cordillera. But there is some residual, since it's not that high, so a great amount of rain gets to the other side, bringing a lot of rain to the western slope of the Central Cordillera. So we will be focusing exactly on that spot. But apart from climate, we also have that the Central Cordillera of Colombia is very active in terms of volcanoes. We have volcanoes with volcanic activity nowadays. So this is interaction between volcanoes and steep slopes and a lot of rainfall make it a very interesting place to study this variability in time. So in terms of vegetation, during El Niño, what you have mostly is that you have very much intensified, like the drier trades and the Chocó, that keep the Chocó jet stream a bit from the side, and you don't get that rainfall, that additional rainfall to the Central Cordillera, and you have very high, like overall dry conditions. So we will be talking about some vegetation changes in that slope. This is more or less the location at 2,000 meters above sea level, but we have more or less these very synthetic vegetation belts that I will be showing during the talk. So a few years ago, I was very lucky to get to know this picture when they were opening the main road. 20 years ago, more or less, a geologist was curious and telling me there were some trunks and organic remains very well preserved. So we were very interested in trying to get those deposits. And nowadays, obviously, there's a road, so it's not like this, but we were lucky enough to, and they recently, last year, opened the road again to clean it and we could, and everything, all the material got exposed, and we were able to sample carefully through the whole profile and take some samples. So we did all the descriptions, geological, stratigraphical, and all the details. And embedded in that material, we found like big chunks of wood that looked like almost recent material. And so we were very enthusiastic about that kind of remains, because in tropical areas, you usually don't get this kind of preservation. High precipitation and high temperatures, you have material degraded almost instantly. So this was like really, really something very, very different and very, we were very enthusiastic about it. So we wrote the project and we decided how to sample for the wood, for the pollen, for biomarkers, GDGTs mostly, and ancient DNA. Unfortunately, I'm not going to talk about that today, but there is a poster tomorrow if you want to have a look. And I will be focusing on 2 wood remains mostly and several pollen samples. Just to tell a story, obviously it has to be chronologically constrained, and I will start by telling you the story about the dating. So this is like the height of the column, like the height, and we at the beginning we thought that the material was quite young because it was very well preserved. So we dated several horizons, and it came to be quite beyond the C14 range. So we went for another dating method, which takes longer, and the uncertainties are much bigger. So nowadays, what we know is that the deposit is older than 50 kiloyears and younger than 200 kiloyears. So here's where pollen becomes, so we think we are moving somewhere in between or we are somehow including or describing a certain moment, a certain time window within the last interglacial. To confirm that, pollen became important. So the resolution is not the best, but it's good enough to realize that there are some changes. Specifically, we see like a dominance of paramo in the top and some tiny spikes that have to be refined, and the dominance of high Andean and lower montane forests. So this brought us to the idea of like independent periods of warm alternating with cold intervals. And we confirmed that by plotting on top like the indicators of cold conditions and temperature reconstruction based on biomarkers. So as you can see, all proxies coincide, and the red bands more or less indicate intervals where warm conditions dominate, and the blue intervals indicate the cold conditions. So in a way, we were happy to realize that we were probably talking about the last interglacial conditions. Obviously, we need like a more chronologically constrained age model, but at the moment, this is what we have. From our data, we could see that cold intervals were more or less something between 4 and 5 degrees colder based on the downslope migration of the paramo. And during warm intervals, we could say that they were warm, or slightly warmer than present, but very similar to present conditions. So based on this we will use it as like a general background of the climatic conditions to help to decide a bit in the like domain in time where we were moving. So we went for 2 specific wood pieces that I will show you today. One is the first one on top, which is 360 centimeters, and the other one is more at the bottom. So the wood, we cut it, and then we did all the analysis, the microanatomical analysis on the microscope. And with this first piece of wood, what we did was first to try to identify who the tree was. So we came out with a good guess that the tree was Jacaranda copaya, very beautiful tree. And today it occurs between 0 and 1,400 meters above sea level, so it's quite tropical. It likes warm climate. And remember, we were sitting around 2,000 meters above sea level. So what we did was some modeling, bioclimatic modeling, extracting all the climatic information that this tree could give us, and then try to plot like the potential distribution of these species under present conditions, and then go back in time, and once again try to compare if we were talking about like last interglacial conditions or last glacial conditions. And we plotted both situations and analyzed both situations, and obviously, as you can see from the plots, the greener the color, then the more likely to find the species in that certain spot. And the ampereira, our site, is indicated by the dot. So it means that under last interglacial conditions you could find, so it's the situation where you can actually find the species, while the glacial conditions will never fit with the occurrence of that piece of wood at that spot. The second wood was another one, another species, exactly with the same approach. What we did was the anatomy, microanatomy, and in this case, we sampled every 200 microns across the piece of wood for stable isotopes, trying to see if there was any cyclicity or signature. We came out with Chrysoclamis, another species from Clusiaceae, tropical. It occurs nowadays in the sampling site. And what we found was this beautiful cyclicity with 5 cycles with an amplitude between 1 and 2.5 per mil, more or less, in the isotopic signal. Once we got to know who the species was, we went to the field and sampled a modern specimen of the same species, trying to see if that species actually could record or was sensitive enough to climate. And what we found is this is a modern climate situation, and the darker line is the ENSO variability, as you see. And then we plotted on top the signature of the modern tree, and we found that they were quite close in depicting and getting like the signature and the amplitude of the precipitation change. So we were quite happy to see that actually our fossil species could be used as an indicator of past paleo-ENSO activity. So in the end, what we did was to compare both signals, the modern signal in green and the subfossil wood signal in blue is the same scale. So the first thing we see is they are completely different. The green one and the blue one, they show different means, indicating that somehow the mean state of like drought, it was like a drought conditions overall, like drier conditions in the past, indicated by this difference of 2.5 to 4 per mil. And we also see a striking difference, which is like the amplitude of the changes. So in one case, the standard deviation is around 1, and in the other case, it's around 0.5. So half of it, half of the amplitude of the change in both cases. So from that information, we conclude that somehow that piece of wood is indicating or suggesting overall drier conditions with changes in amplitude. And we are not sure, it's difficult to conclude, but apparently less frequent ENSO, because obviously this is longitude across the sampling, across the wood, and obviously if you have compression, then this distance will change. So it's difficult to say something about the frequency, but amplitude for sure, they are different. And if we compare those data from this recent publication, we see that the change you need to, to have a change from 31 per mil to minus 28 per mil, you end up, or that's equivalent to say, like an this diminishment of 1,200 millimeters per year, which is quite a lot. So in the end, if we come back to the initial background state, we can say that we had this difference in temperature, and on top of that, at very high resolution, we can say that we had like drier than today conditions and weaker ENSO signature. And this becomes very important if we really want to model in the future this relationship between ENSO and climate change. If this happens to be, and the chronology actually fits our idea, and we are talking about last interglacial, then it would be of great importance to understand this relationship between ENSO and warming. So obviously we have to refine the age and understand the differences between proxies, but overall we could have a nice clue about the climate change at very high resolution in the northern Andes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me start by acknowledging my colleagues at MIT, especially David McGee, whose ideas have led this work, and then Brian Green and John Marshall, who have substantially contributed to the discussion of these results. Today I'm going to talk about the connection we think exists between the trade wind and the ITCZ shifts in the past. So we have seen today the ITCZ figure a few times within the intense precipitation in the tropics, that nowadays in the observation is slightly north of the equator. And we also know from proxies that the position of the ITCZ have changed over time. For instance, during hydroclimate, proxies suggest that the ITCZ moves south. For instance, I have here the delta 18.0 from Greenland, and these gray bars are hydroclimate, and this proxy for precipitation here in the Konecky Basin, it suggests that the ITCZ moves south during the hydroclimate, and also during the younger Dryas. But this information comes from proxies for precipitation. I have here a few of them. We have here a few of them. But the problem is that we are missing a lot of information from here, from the ocean basin, from where we cannot obtain proxies for precipitation. So the idea of this work is to bring into the discussion the proxies for trade winds and see whether they can say something about ITCZ migration in the past. Because in the end, convergence here, the ITCZ, means that we have convergence of winds at low levels. And I'm going to show that we find consistent connection between the ITCZ migration during hydroclimate and the changes in the trade winds between the hemispheres. During hydric events, we know that the AMOC collapsed due to these iceberg discharges in the north. This caused a shutdown of the heat transport by the AMOC, leading to anomalous cooling in the northern hemisphere and some warming in the southern hemisphere. The response of the atmosphere to this anomalous interhemispheric heat, in contrast, can be seen here, and it's as a southward ITCZ migration. So if we start from a symmetric circulation case where we have two Hadley cells around the equator, and the trade winds at the surface, the westerly winds are of similar strength, and then we impose this interhemispheric heat. In contrast, the ITCZ has to move south to transport heat northward across the equator. And the change in the trade winds are going to be like, we are going to have an intensification of the trade winds in the northern hemisphere and weakening of the trade winds in the southern hemisphere. And these results are just based on theory, based on energy conservation and based on angular momentum conservation. So I have here again this schematic figure with suggesting a southward ITCZ shift. And if I turn this left, we can see here the anomalies we might expect to see in response to an ITCZ shift, with intensification of the trade winds here and a weakening in the opposite hemisphere. Well, then this is based on theory, but we can go to models and see whether we see similar results as those is predicted by the theory. So we have used results from 2 different climate models. One is a trace 21KS simulation, and the another one is in which we have studied the anomalies between the 101 and the LGM. So here shading is precipitation anomalies, and I here have the zonally average precipitation anomaly. And down here I have another experiment, the housing experiments with the CM2MC model and the LGM boundary conditions. And for both cases, we see the shading the shading shows that there is a decrease in precipitation in the northern hemisphere, and increase in precipitation in the southern hemisphere. It is very evident in the zonally average, even though the pattern might change between the models. If we look at the winds on top of these precipitation anomalies, we find in both models an intensification of the trade winds in the northern hemisphere and decrease in the trade winds in the southern hemisphere. And again, it's very consistent in the zonally average. So theory predicts and model confirm that a southward ITCZ migration is connected to an interhemispheric asymmetric response in the trade winds. Then we can go to proxies and see whether we find similar responses there. What sort of proxies we have for changes in trade winds? Well, we have wind-blown dust, we have grain size, we have sundown activity, and also we have changes in coastal upwelling driven by the wind, changes in SST, in nutrient supply, in a way that if we have an intensification of the trades, we should expect to see an increase in the upwelling and a cooling at the surface. Whereas if we have a decrease in the trades, we expect to see a decrease in the upwelling and a warming at the surface. We have collected proxies for all these locations from the literature that is available nowadays, and the idea is to see whether there's some consistency between model results here, the arrows and the proxy and the changes in proxies. For instance, here the Konecky Basin. Here we have two different proxies. One is biogenic sediment abundance, and the other one is SST. Top here, I have the reconstructed temperature differences between the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. So this cold excursion means that the northern hemisphere got much colder. And in the 101 and the younger dryas, these two proxies can indicate colder conditions and increase in the biogenic sediment abundance. Changes that can be interpreted as an identification of the trade winds in that region. If I zoom out a little bit and I go to the Western African coast, we find proxies for wind-blown dust. We have biogenic fluxes, opal or organic carbon, and then we have SSTs. And again, we have cooling during the hydric stadials at younger dryas, and an increase in primary productivity and dust by the wind. And all the changes indicate an intensification of the trade winds in the subtropical North Atlantic. If I go to the southern hemisphere, for instance, the tropical South Atlantic, we have a much longer record covering the last glacier period, and we have proxies for conditions at the surface, temperature conditions at the surface, and also changes in the dust grain size. And during hydric events, we have this proxy indicates warmer conditions and a decrease in the size of the grain. So these changes can then be interpreted as a decrease in the trade winds in this region. If I go globally, we find consistent changes in the model and in the reconstruction, with the increased trade winds in the northern hemisphere and decrease in the trade winds in the southern hemisphere. Unfortunately, we have there are few reconstructed and have low confidence because the chronology does not allow a very robust description of the Heinrich event. And then it's important to see that the southern hemisphere is relatively well unsampled. So we encourage people to get reconstruction for trade winds in these regions in the southern hemisphere. And so far I have shown the trade winds changes as a passive response of ITCZ migration, but actually understanding the changes in trade winds is important because the circulation of the ocean in the tropical region is driven by trade winds. So back to this schematic figure in which I'm showing a southward ITCZ shift. We said that this was aiming to compensate this interhemispheric heating contrast, transporting heat across the equator into the colder hemisphere. And this leads to stronger trade winds in the northern hemisphere and weaker trades in the southern hemisphere. But then the circulation of the ocean responds similarly with a stronger wind-driven circulation in the northern hemisphere and a weaker in the southern hemisphere. And these transport also heat in the same direction as the atmosphere does. And in this work here by Brian Green and John Marshall, they have looked at how important is this coupling between the atmosphere and the ocean, and they have forced the climate with an interhemispheric heating contrast in a way that when they have atmospheric ocean coupled to a slab ocean, this is without dynamics. The ITCZ has to migrate these mats to compensate this heating contrast. But when they have a coupled system, with this heat transferred by the ocean, the ITCZ doesn't have to move that much, but because this heat transfer is actually doing a better job than the one by the atmosphere. So the ocean circulation can dampen the ITCZ shift in the past. So to conclude, I have some from theories, from climate models and proxies that a southward ITCZ shift is connected to a stronger trade winds in the northern hemisphere and weaker trades in the southern hemisphere. This is important because it gives us a better picture, a more complete picture of Hadley's sail dynamics in the past. And it's also important to understand the ocean dynamics driven by the winds and how they might have dampened ITCZ shifts in the past. Finally, I still encourage you to obtain more high-quality, high-resolution trade wind reconstruction, especially in the Pacific and throughout the southern hemisphere. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, everybody, for being here. I recognize that I'm speaking at the same time as George Philander, which means you either chose to be here or you didn't look at that page in the schedule, so I really appreciate either way that you're here. And I won't be talking about the incipient glacial, but I will be talking about the last glacial maximum, and specifically some work that I've been doing to try to understand hydroclimate change in the tropics during that time. So the LGM is a period of time I've been focusing on for reasons that you're probably all familiar with. It is what we think of as a big hammer. But it's not just any old sledgehammer, it's also a hammer that we know something about. We have a pretty good sense for what the magnitude and the time series are of these forcings. Is there a pointer here? Yes, of these forcings on the bottom left of the screen. So that enables us to ask some really complex questions, actually, about how different climate forcings impact the tropical water cycle in general. And when I say the tropical water cycle, I want to, I'm going to probably push the wrong button. No, I didn't. I want to emphasize that we often talk about precipitation when we're talking about hydroclimate, but the water cycle is much, much more than just precipitation. There's a lot of other things going on. And if our goal is to ultimately use paleo data to understand modern climate change or future climate change, then all of these other boxes in this diagram are really important too. So I'm going to zoom in on this part of the world, the Indo-Pacific warm pool, partly because it's at the heart of the tropical rain belt, and so it's a really important place to work in, but also because there's some really interesting contrasts in proxy data that have led to some really interesting, sometimes opposing conclusions about what's going on there at the LGM. So what I'm showing here is a figure from a recent compilation. Every dot, we'll talk about the shading on this figure in a second, but every dot that you see is a site, a paleo proxy data site, where the LGM was drier than it was during the Holocene. And so you'll notice off the bat that almost every dot in the worm pool here is brown. And that's just showing that there's really good evidence from a wide range of proxies that the LGM was very dry in the worm pool. And the model results from this particular study, that's what's shown in the shading here. They were able to use the community Earth system model. This is D'Anezio and colleagues who were able to use CESM, reproduce this drying in the worm pool, which was actually really unusual, and attributed it to changes in sea level and the exposure of the Sunda and Sahul shelves, which ultimately cooled off those areas, triggered air-sea feedbacks, and ultimately dried out the worm pool via a weakening of the Walker circulation. So that makes sense with what we know about the Walker circulation, and it makes sense with all the data that's pictured on this map, but there's some really important exceptions to this map. And those are the stars that I've plotted here on this site. There's more and more coming online as the years go by. And what all of these sites have in common is that they're all proxies of some kind for the delta O18 or delta D of precipitation. So there's a couple of groundwater records up here, there's a couple of speleothems, and a few sediment records. And so they're all different types of proxies. The one thing in common is that they're based on water isotopes. And so to remind you, we often, and probably for the past 50, 60 some odd years in paleoclimate, have interpreted water isotopes in the tropics to mainly be reflecting the amount effect, whereby more or less precipitation on a monthly basis collected out and on island stations in the middle of the ocean tended to correspond to more enriched delta O18. So we've been able to use that to infer either wetter or drier climates in the past based on this empirical relationship that we're actually beginning to understand is much more complicated than we thought. But either way, by the amount effect, if we have such strong evidence in the worm pool for such dry conditions, we should expect strongly enriched delta O18. Instead, we don't see that. We see responses that are either muted or in the opposite direction of what we would expect. And so there's a lot of people out there who are really skeptical about isotopes and will say, well, maybe there's some weird thing, some chaos going on with the isotope records. Maybe there's very localized effects. Not the case. We have many different proxies from this region now that are starting to show a really similar evolution from the LGM to present in terms of what the isotopic composition of precipitation looked like. And especially here, these two sites in southern Indonesia, these two dots up here, showing that the LGM was just as depleted as the wet, modern, or late Holocene. But this record in the middle here is one that I worked on extensively as part of my PhD. This is a leaf wax delta D record, where we were also able to measure lots of other proxies from the exact same sediment cores to show that, in fact, the LGM was very dry. We have a lot of different evidence for that. This also jives with what we know from the other types of proxies in the region. So overall, we're seeing evidence from multiple sites that the LGM delta O18 or delta D of precipitation was is less enriched than it should have been via the amount effect. So, of course, the question is why? What's going on with these isotope records? And I've spent the last several years of my PhD learning how to run the isotope-enabled community Earth system model so that we can start to answer this question. So what I'm going to show here are some results from simulations with water isotope tracers enabled, coupled between the land and the atmosphere model, with isotope tracers fully incorporated throughout the land and the atmosphere, and prescribed sea surface conditions using the sea surface conditions from the D'Anezio et al. Simulations that I showed you on the previous slide. And so what this enables us to do is to ask, well, for a given change in climate, for a given change in precipitation, what is the isotopic response that we get? I I ran 5 different experiments. The first 2 are full forcing experiments from the LGM and from the pre-industrial to compare. And then 3 single forcing experiments. And these ones were where we left everything at pre-industrial conditions except for sea level, ice sheet albedo and topography, and greenhouse gases. And so this allows us to look at the forcing-specific response in delta 18 of precipitation. So at the top here is just the change in precipitation amount. This is an annual average coming from the simulations. We see this big drying of the warm pool. Western Indian Ocean is wetter. This is not new. Dinesi et al. Already showed that. It means that I set up the simulations right, which is good. But things get really interesting when we start looking at the delta 018 of precipitation. So I've done a little bit of a tricky thing here. I've inverted these color scales, and that's in order to emphasize the amount effect. So if we see red with red, that means less precipitation, more enriched amount effect. If we see blue with blue, more precipitation, more depleted amount effect. And what you'll notice is that you don't see a lot of red with red or blue with blue on these maps, right? So this is suggesting off the bat that the amount effect is weaker here than we would have predicted. There are places in the world and in the tropics especially where we see really big changes in the delta 018 of precipitation, but not much going on in terms of precipitation amount. And then there's other parts of the world, especially in the warm pool, where we see this really massive change in precipitation amount, but really not much happening. This is sort of a dog that didn't bark down here in delta 018. So then we ask the question, well, is this a forcing-specific issue? Is the amount effect weaker when there's only one particular climate forcing at work? And the answer is no, but sort of depending on where you look. So this is now the ice sheet only experiment where we have a weak amount effect here, actually a strong amount effect here. This is the greenhouse gas only simulation, weak amount effect pretty much everywhere. Sea level only experiment, weak amount effect again. What's interesting here though is that in these previous 2, you see a lot of blue kind of across this map here, right? But then in this, we see that the changes are really localized. And that was really interesting because sea level, unlike changes in ice sheets or changes in greenhouse gases, doesn't really affect the overall temperature gradients in the global atmosphere. It's really just showing this kind of localized change local to the Indo-Pacific warm pool, which started to make us wonder whether there were actually some influences of temperature going on here in the delta 18 of precipitation. So for tropical people, that's sort of anathema to say, right? Because we know that the direct effects of temperature on the delta 18 of precipitation tend to be pretty small in the tropics for the magnitude of changes that we're seeing. But there's all these indirect effects that are really important. Temperature changes evapotranspiration. It changes circulation and the way that moisture moves around in the atmosphere. There's a lot of other things that it changes, and importantly, the relationship between these multiple influences really strongly affects the delta 18 of precipitation. So what I'm showing here is sort of the taking a step back moisture budget perspective of the delta 18 of precipitation, where on the right here we have one grid cell or maybe one experimental forest, sort of the size of a grid cell, whatever you would think of, and the budget of moisture in that grid cell, in that column, really depends on just a few things in this simplified case. It depends on precipitation, it depends on ET, evapotranspiration, and if precipitation and ET are not balanced by each other, that means there's either moisture coming in via convergence or moisture leaving via divergence. And I put runoff really tiny down here because I'm not going to be talking about it. It doesn't really affect these calculations we're making. So ultimately, we can write out this very simple moisture balance. And this is what the isotope ratios are sensitive to. They're sensitive not just to the change in those fluxes overall, but their relative changes relative to the amount of precipitation and also the isotopic composition of those fluxes. And all of these we can get out of the model either directly, or in the case of the isotopic composition of convergence, we can calculate it using this mass balance equation. So on the top here is ET at the LGM, or the LGM minus 1850. And so you can see that at the LGM, ET is reduced pretty much everywhere in the tropics. This makes sense. It was colder. What's really interesting is then when we look down at this lower map, we look at convergence, and there's actually a lot of patterns here that are really cool. But what I wanted to draw your eye to was that convergence really decreases over these kind of wettest parts of the Earth, of the deep tropics, the Amazon rainforest, the Congo, and the maritime continent. You could almost even kind of outline the Amazon basin or the Congo basin based on this figure. So that's really cool, because those of you who are familiar with the biotic pump hypothesis, that's suggesting that there's feedbacks between rainforest processes and precipitation, positive feedbacks. And so this is suggesting maybe that biotic pump was weaker at the LGM, which is a really neat finding. But importantly, the isotopic composition of that convergence is really important. And so we're seeing at the top here is this delta O18 of precipitation, which is what I've been showing you for the past couple of slides, or a few slides ago. And at the bottom here is the isotopic composition of convergence. And so we see in these areas where, like the Amazon, where we have a bit of an enrichment, but not that strong, where the amount effect was kind of weak, like over the warm pool, these are places where the isotopic composition of convergence, of moisture that's coming into those grid cells, is really enriched. And so that's suggesting that because we know that convergence is going down overall, we're removing that more enriched component from the equation, thereby making these areas less enriched than they should be, weakening the amount effect. In other words, moisture source matters. This should be obvious, but it bears repeating. And finally, just to wrap up, of course, we were interested in whether this was a forcing-specific response. Are there certain types of climate forcings that matter more for influencing the isotopic composition of convergence? And the answer is yes. This on the top here is the all forcings experiment, and then these are the 3 single forcing experiments below. And you can see that the ice sheet only experiment is really the only one that starts to really approach what we see on the top here. So what that's suggesting is that changes in ice sheets change the way that moisture moves around the tropics, ultimately changes the isotopic composition of that moisture. This has been found before. People have talked a lot about changes in the ITCZ that have occurred in response to ice sheets. But we're seeing these changes even in the absence of changes in precipitation amount, remember. So this is really something that's almost independent of changes in precipitation amount. So just to summarize, we have this really interesting contrast between precipitation and the delta O18 of precipitation, where in this experiment, which agrees well with the data, changes in sea level are really important for precipitation amount by the weakening of the Walker circulation and some other mechanisms. But when it comes to the delta O18 of precipitation, it's really ice sheets and greenhouse gases, which I didn't get a chance to talk about, that really strongly influence the delta O18 of precipitation. And that's mainly by changes in convergence and the relationship between convergence and ET and how those work together to form a moisture budget for a particular spot on Earth. And also by changing the isotopic composition of those fluxes. So ultimately, this means that we have the potential for fingerprinting these changes in the water cycle, maybe even forcing specific responses by smartly using different types of proxies as well as models. So I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but I will just leave these shameless plugs up on the screen, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
If you have a shorter rainfall season but more intense at the same time, you could have both like a drier annual budget and more negative delta 18 of the rainfall, right?
Yeah, so you're talking about the seasonal distribution of rainfall and its influences on delta O18 at the LGM or in general, or single forcing?
In the case that you were presenting, that you see a contradiction, apparent contradiction between drier conditions recorded by some records but more depleted delta 18 value. I mean, changing the distribution of rainfall may have this kind of effect.
Yep,
I wonder if you looked at that.
That's an important point, yeah. So we did look at it when it comes to the proxy data, absolutely, because that's always the first culprit that we try to investigate, is whether seasonality is important. In a lot of these places, it's hard to get mean annual changes in precipitation amount without also changing the sort of the summer rainfall in those particular sites, at least in the warm pool. There's other places where I think that could have a stronger influence. But it's really hard to say. It's hard to get to a point where you can say, well, maybe there was a shorter but more intense monsoon, but overall mean annual precip went down. It's just hard to get to that point in the warm pool. You can get to it in other parts of the world. In the model, I haven't yet teased apart the seasonal influences, other than to say that the particular season you're looking at really matters for this disconnect between precip amount and the delta O18 of precip. For example, in March, April, May, that disconnect is really huge, where you could look at these two maps and not even know that they're related to each other, whereas other seasons, it's maybe less important, maybe the amount effect is stronger.
So this is talking to some of the questions that have been asked. Particularly, there have been two talks relating the changes in the overturning circulation during Heinrich stadials with the ITCZ. So this is when I'm thinking about, can we put sort of the ITCZ into the context of energy? And the answer is no, with some caveats, of course, but I think that the answer to this is no. So first of all, a little sort of background of why we might be thinking about this sort of thing. So you've seen this picture up at the top quite a bit. So this is a picture of the rainfall in the tropical regions, and you can see that there are these kind of very appealing sort of zonally uniform bands. And if you average the precipitation around latitude circles, this is called taking a zonal average, for those of you who aren't aware of it, you can come up with this beautiful sort of picture where you have this very peaked rainfall, and you have this thing that we sort of think of as the zonal mean, ITCZ. It sits north of the equator, and it's a very distinctive feature. Another thing that we know is that you can kind of consider that the Hadley circulation is a kind of a heat engine. It's a way of moving heat around in the atmosphere. And to kind of make a little more concrete why we think about this, so the line in the middle shows us the ITCZ, and precipitation associated with the ITCZ goes along with convection. When you have convection, you have rising motion. If you have rising motion at the equator, you've got to have some convergence. And especially if you're talking about zonal mean ascent, that means you have to have convergence from the north and the south. And aloft, you've got to have some divergence. Associated with this convergence and divergence, there is some sort of movement of energy. So if we consider the energy that there is, so we have basically, this is the moist static energy, of which there are three components. There's the temperature, moisture content, and the geopotential. If you look at the surface circulation, the key element of the moist static energy there is the temperature and moisture. When you go aloft, it's colder and it's drier, but you're further from the surface, so geopotential is really important. And it turns out that if you kind of look at the balances, that actually it's the branch at the top, the diverging branch, which is most important in moving heat around in the atmosphere. So we have the situation I've shown here where we have the ascent happening on the equator and divergence. No heat is being moved. But what happens if, if, as is the case, the ITCZ lies off the equator? Well, now, because we have this heat being moved in the upper branch, we can get this movement of heat. And some of there have been arguments made that this movement of heat by the ITCZ is in some way balancing what's going on in the ocean. Now, that's a kind of an annual average view, and we might sort of ask the question, well, how does this sort of evolve? You know, if we're thinking about how things change, how does it evolve? And one thing that we can do is we can look at the seasonal cycle. The seasonal cycle is, relatively well observed. And if you plot on the bottom the amount of heat that's being transported across the equator against the location of the ITCZ, you get this beautiful linear correlation. And that can kind of make you think, okay, yeah, if I move the ITCZ off the equator, I'm going to change the amount of heat that's, changing. And so if we start thinking about things like Heinrich events, where we think ocean heat transport might change, then one way of sort of counteracting to any of these changes in the heat transport might be through moving the ITCZ. First caveat, it actually matters how you measure the ITCZ. This beautiful correlation here comes if you define as your ITCZ, if you take the average over basically the entire tropics and find the middle of the precipitation. So the trouble is, to calculate that, you need to know the precipitation across, basically 20 north to 20 south. It's quite a, big ask. And it's not really what we kind of conventionally think of. So if we back all the way up to here, what draws your eye is the peak in the precipitation rather than the kind of the average. But if you look at where the maximum precipitation is, the relationship changes slightly. And if you look at other different metrics of the ITCZ, you can come up with even more sort of different relationships. So how you measure the ITCZ matters. And the relationship can change by a factor of 2, so this is not an insignificant change. But anyway, so over the seasonal cycle, it seems that there is this kind of fairly robust-ish relationship between heat transport and location of the ITCZ. So it's kind of appealing, right? We want to understand how things change in the past. We want to understand Heinrich events. So we could ask the question, how does this thing work with force changes? And there are 2 things that I'm going to sort of consider. The first is the seasonal cycle a good template for force changes in the ITCZ? We can observe the seasonal cycle. We can't really observe any force changes. So we need to make this leap of faith that understanding the seasonal cycle is going to help us understand force changes. Is that a valid thing to do? Next thing, this works beautifully for the zonal mean, but we don't, when we, disappear off to Sulawesi and go and take a sediment core, we are not measuring the zonal mean. We are measuring the location, the precipitation at that location. How well can we relate the two? So, this has been sort of looked at in the past, and Aaron Donahoe did a beautiful job of this, and he looked at the PMIT models to see how the ITCZ and the heat transport relationship changed. Slight problem, though, with the PMIT models, there are 3 different forcings, but 15 different models. So when you look at a relationship in the changes, you're not really looking at the relationship in terms of forcing, you're more looking at the changes of how do different models, respond to this. And that's not the same question. We're very lucky in Bristol that we run HADCM3 an awful lot, and we have 363 simulations of exactly the same model with various different glacial and interglacial forcing. We've changed greenhouse gases, orbital forcing, ice sheets. And so we can actually ask the question, if we do force the model with these kind of glacial simulations, how does the ITCZ and heat transport relationship change? So, this is, again, the seasonal cycle, and plotted in the middle are all of these 363 runs on the same scale. So the first thing to note is that when force changes are really small. You're talking about a degree. So this is about 110 kilometers. You can cycle that in a day. So if you have... yes, you can. So in order to measure these kind of changes, you need to have really precise records of the zonal mean ITCZ. So that's just something to bear in mind there. Now, if you kind of deconvolve the two, on the left, we've got the seasonal cycle, and on the right, we have the force changes. And again, this is looking at this metric which averages over the whole of the tropics. And if you look at the force results, actually it's quite good. We get this sort of linear trend, and it's actually relatively good correlations. The black lines are some kind of independent. These are housing simulations, which basically, it's what happens if we put a really big kick to the system. And what you see is that, if we look at the heat transport and this average over the entire globe, then the situation kind of works quite nicely. But if you look at the slope of the lines, so if you look, there is a dashed line in the far right-hand plot, and there's the solid line. The dashed line is the line for the seasonal cycle. So the relationship between heat transport and the location of the ITCZ is actually totally different with response to forcing as it is to the seasonal cycle. So the seasonal cycle is not actually a very good representation of, changes. So it's not a good template to use. Why is this? So I don't want to belabor this, but just focus on the red bars. So the red bars show how much heat is being transported by the Hadley circulation. Now, the whole of the energetic framework relies on thinking about changes in the Hadley circulation. And if you look on the left-hand side, these are changes in the seasonal cycle. And you can see that the red bars are huge. So yes, on the seasonal cycle, the Hadley circulation is really important. If you now look at the left-hand side, these are 4 runs. What you can see is the red bars are no longer the most important. There are other ways of moving heat across the equator that are just as important as the Hadley circulation. And this kind of explains why we do not see the same relationship on the seasonal cycle and in response to forcing. So that's answering the question, is the seasonal cycle a good template? And I would argue, no, it's not a very good template. And then there is the problem is, well, you know, how theoretically might we try and understand it? The next question I posed was, is the zonal mean a good way of, you know, thinking about changes? On the left-hand side, again, is our favourite, the centroid precipitation. So this is the average over the whole of the tropics. On the other side, we have a metric which thinks about where is the maximum precipitation. We have a sort of a reasonable correlation, but our group of independent hosing simulations are poorly explained by the, this relationship. So we're beginning to sort of see a breakdown when we start thinking about more sort of specific locations. An alternative way to do this is what happens if we just plot the sort of position of the ITCZ in the West Pacific. And here you can see that, you know, there's I would say a dreadful relationship between position of the ITCZ and heat transport. So as we're looking out on the local scale, these zonal mean metrics just bear no resemblance to what is going on locally. An even more concrete example, if the zonal mean metrics were representative of local precipitation, you would hope that if I took two simulations which have the same zonal mean ITCZ, then the precipitation patterns would look pretty similar. On the top are two simulations that I just randomly chose. The ITCZ is in the same location. There are huge changes in the precipitation. Where there are crosses, they differ by more than 50%. So you can have, you know, rainfall north in one region, in south in another, south in one region, north in another. And when you're considering the zonal mean, the averaging just, you know, doesn't care. Similarly, if you look at simulations with the same heat transport, same thing, patterns in the local precipitation can be dramatically different. So, the energetic framework, I would say, is useful if and only if you can define your rainfall distribution across the entire tropics. You need to know the distribution, you know, all the way around and from, you know, 20 north to 20 south. That's a big ask if you are wondering about, you know, times in the past. Furthermore, there is actually currently no theoretical basis for understanding why these force changes in the ITCZ are related to heat transport. Over the seasonal cycle, it is because of the Hadley circulation. But when you incorporate forcing, the Hadley circulation is no longer the dominant means by which heat is transported across the equator. And how do these two things marry? It's actually, given the simulations that showed, you know, that the Hadley circulation is not dominant, it stuns me that there is any relationship. So this is a theoretical question that needs to be answered. Finally, if you look on the sort of the local scale, so if you're looking at a location in the Central Pacific, the zonal mean metrics, which kind of conform to the energetic framework, really do not, you know, it's very difficult to place them in this sort of zonal mean context. So no, we should not place local precipitation records into some global zonal mean context. And as we've been listening to, you know, the talks, particularly when concerning Heinrich events, where, you know, there is a change in the ocean circulation, I would place the argument. So if you read the original sort of papers, so the Chang and Bitts paper, their explanation of why the ITCZ moved was in terms of local sea surface temperature. When you do a hosing simulation, you throw all of this fresh water in, you dramatically change the gradient of temperature in the Atlantic. And as a result, the precipitation moves as a response. At the same time, when you put a large amount of fresh water, the ocean circulation collapses, and in some cases, but I will stress not all, in some cases there is a change in the ocean heat transport. These two are not necessarily related. So when you're kind of considering these, basin scale things, what you need to think about is the processes in this basin that will change the precipitation, not how is it relating to some sort of energetic fluxes over the whole globe. Thank you.
Is it possible to extend the concept of the energetic framework into 2 dimensions? I think last year William Booth published a paper on that.
Yeah, so the problem is that his concept still relies on believing that the Hadley circulation, well, one, to have 2 dimensions, well, yes, I don't. You can't do it in 1 dimension. So trying to extend it to 2 is, to me, it seems nuts. There is no because the change. So the the blue bars. Those are the change in the stationary eddy heat transport. So if you had an ITCZ that was absolutely flat, nothing would happen. But if you have one that wiggles like this, where you have sort of northward heat transport in one part and southward in another, that is a huge component. And if you start trying to consider how, to place, to reduce the thing to 2 dimensions when you have something varying like that, I genuinely have no idea how you can do it. I think my argument is that to do it we understand sort of the Hadley circulation, and it fails. We really don't understand the circulation in the east-west direction. So to try and say that we can, project onto that axis, I think is a stretch.
Great. Well, good afternoon, and I just want to thank the conveners for putting together this really great session, and I also want to thank Bronwen for giving an excellent introduction to water isotopes. And today I'm going to present to you some work that I've been doing with Naomi Levin and Ben Passy at the University of Michigan, and taking our oxygen isotopes to the next level. We're looking at triple oxygen isotopes. Bronwen gave a great overview of our traditional use of oxygen 16 and 18, and today I'm throwing in the mix oxygen 17 that we can now measure with some technological advances at high precision. And I'm going to relate to you how we're using triple oxygen isotopes as a proxy for evaporation, and specifically how we're applying it to Paleolake sediment core from East Africa. So I'm going to pose the question, start here, why an evaporation proxy? Do we need it? And thank you, Bronwen. I think you did a great job of illustrating that we do. And just as Bronwen said, precipitation minus evaporation really is critical to our understanding of the water cycle, both in the present and future changes as well as the past. And I think something that really illustrates this well is just simply thinking of the wet gets wetter, dry gets drier paradigm that has been proposed for future changes in the water cycle, and it's often represented as the response of our P minus E patterns to global warming. So I think we've done a great job of focusing on the precipitation side of it, and hopefully today I'll show you that we can start to get more traction on the evaporation side. And then secondly, to disentangle our proxy signals. Again, our carbonate oxygen isotopes represent a mixed signal. Both our parent water isotopic compositions as well as temperature, which our community's done really well at going after. But then also our parent waters, we can't just assume that they reflect our meteoric water's isotopic composition. It may also be altered by evaporation, which may impact that hydroclimate signal that we're chasing. However, an important question to ask, though, is how important is this evaporation signal? And I would say that depends on your archive and your setting. And I think Bronwen showed that may be more important in more settings than I thought before coming down here. But a really good illustration of where it is, I think, very significant for us to think about, Horton et al. In 2015 really illustrated the significance of evaporative enrichment of lake waters, which are going to affect our lake records by simply plotting our lake water oxygen isotopes versus meteoric water, we can really see, and then separating this by arid and human conditions, we can see that in arid conditions, we can get exceed 10 per mil evaporative enrichment of our waters, and even can get that range in humid areas. So today I'm going to present to you this multi-proxy approach that Naomi Levin and Ben Passy have really pioneered of measuring our carbonate oxygen isotopes, then using the clumped isotope paleothermometer to reconstruct our parent water isotopic compositions. And then to get at that evaporation component, we throw in the mix triple oxygen isotopes, so our CAP 17O, which uses that rare 17 oxygen 17 isotopes to get a handle on the extent of evaporation that may have been our sample may have been subjected to, ultimately to get an idea of what was the isotopic composition of our carbonate, of our parent waters prior to evaporation. And so I'm applying this technique to a Paleo Lake sediment core recovered from the Southern Kenya Rift in 2012. And it covers the mid-Pleistocene. And as you can see, here is our the drill rig, and the lake basin is completely dry today. So this is an ancient lake basin. And what we see by just giving you a snapshot of the core is that we do see these dry periods several times throughout this record. And this gives us an idea, first, that evaporation likely is a very significant player in this record. We see these paleosol sequences, but then also we have deep lake and shallow lake facies. So just also it's a complicated core to work with, and so adding in multiple proxies in addition to just our carbonate delta 18O can really help us get at better interpreting this record. I also want to point out that this core is very low in organic matter, so our usual go-to proxy for hydroclimate in lake sediments in this region, so leaf wax delta D, is a bit more difficult to use, and so our carbonate isotopes really are our best bet for reconstructing hydroclimate in this record. And so before I go any further, I just want to give you all a quick crash course in triple oxygen isotope systematics. And I want to begin just by presenting a simple scenario illustrating how different evaporative histories can yield the same oxygen isotopic composition. So if we consider three different lake basins with different original oxygen isotopic compositions of that water, with different evaporative stresses, you can imagine how they can all converge on the same isotopic composition. So if we then go measure this in our lake core as carbonate, we may misinterpret this record by thinking that these three samples all represent the same hydroclimate conditions, where indeed, if we had this prior knowledge, we'd know that they were actually quite different. And so in water isotope land, we would go and look at dxs to deconvolve this evaporation signal, where dxs is the deviation from equilibrium conditions. The problem is we don't often have in the same archive deuterium isotopes and carbonate isotopes that we can measure, that we can compare in a one-to-one fashion. And so that's where oxygen 17 steps in, and is specifically this oxygen 17 excess or CAP 17O. And essentially, in a nutshell, it behaves similarly to DXS. And the advantage is since we're just looking at oxygen species, we can measure this in our carbonates. And then just throughout the talk, I'm going to be showing our data in this CAP 17O space where kinetic fractionation it goes downwards. And then just going back to our scenario, when we put this in triple oxygen isotope space, you can really see how these samples that looked similar in just delta 18O space, we really get that separation in CAP 17O space. So just to remind you, this is the kind of method that I'll be employing, and the key objectives that I'm going to, or results that I'm going to show you, we're going to reconstruct our parent water oxygen isotopes and triple oxygen isotope space. We're going to use this to better understand what are the lake basin types that these carbonates may have formed in. Then we're going to look at just doing some simple modeling to try and reconstruct what the isotopic composition was of these parent waters prior to evaporation, and then ultimately get a handle of an estimate on how much evaporative enrichment these samples may have experienced. So here I'm showing our carbonate oxygen isotopes in triple oxygen isotope space. The colored markers represent the samples from this study from Localized, with the red coming from our paleosol sequences and the blue from our lacustrine sequences. And then I've also thrown in some of these gray markers which show other samples that we have measured in our lab, pedogenic nodules from East Africa, and then lacustrine samples from the Western US. And the key thing that I want you to draw from this is this general inverse relationship between our CAP 17.0 and our delta 18.0. And this really is indicative of an evaporation signal. And I also want to note just that this is a fairly significant spread. So this gives us an idea that we do have variable evaporative stress happening on these samples throughout time. For the sake of time, I'm just going to say we used our clumped isotopes to take out the temperature component. These are just some stats from our isotopes with an average of about 25 degrees C from those, and we used the Kim and O'Neill equation to remove that temperature component. And then here are reconstructed parent waters in triple oxygen isotope space. And what we found over the past decade or so of measuring this on waters is that based on the degree of evaporation, you really can separate, the degree of evaporation really kind of falls into separate bins in triple oxygen isotope space. And what we find is that none of our samples fall within the precipitation range, indicating that all of these samples have experienced some degree of evaporation. And specifically our Localized samples are some of the most highly evaporative ones that we have measured in the lab so far, indicating again how big a driver evaporation is on this record. And I just wanted to point out these really low samples in CAP 17.0, so very enriched samples in delta 18.0, and how our triple oxygen isotopes are helping us interpret this section of the core. So when this section was recovered, it was originally interpreted as possibly deep lake sediments with the fine laminations. Our triple oxygen isotopes, however, was showing a highly evaporative signal really calls that into question. And now, in addition, with an addition of other indicators in the core, we're now interpreting this possibly as being formed in a shallow lake environment where diatom blooms are occurring in shallow waters that are highly evaporative. So then the next thing I wanted to do with this data set was our key objective is then can we get at what the isotopic composition was of these waters prior to evaporation, and can we estimate how much evaporative enrichment they've experienced? And so to do this, I just applied just simply the triple oxygen isotope meteoric waterline, which has been developed by Luz and Barkin. And just to show you graphically, what we're doing is essentially just following a kinetic fractionation slope back to a reference local CAP 17.0 value along the slope of the global meteoric waterline. The problem with this is that our system is underdetermined. We don't know what the characteristic fractionation slope we should follow is, and we're not really sure how far we want to go back with our to our reference, what our reference CAP 17.0 value of our original precipitation was. So instead, I just decided to do 3 different fractionation scenarios of looking at some high and low fractionation in members that are pegged to triple oxygen isotope observations of West African rainfall to get at this reference CAP 17.0 space. And then also just using some in-member kinetic fractionation slopes based on theoretical modeling just to see how far we can push the system. So again, here's our model parameters or outline guidelines, and then here is our data with these 3 fractionation scenarios applied. And what we see is with our high fractionation scenario, on average, this is giving us about 15 per mil enrichment. With our average fractionation scenario, 8 per mil enrichment, and then our low of about 4 per mil enrichment. And so just to couch this in reality of how reasonable these estimates are, we do find that whenever we plot the typical triple auction isotope space for African rainfall, our average and low scenarios fall within that range, giving us an idea that 4 to 8 per mil enrichment isn't too far off the mark, and that may be a reasonable estimate for what we can expect from these samples. If we then throw in our highly enriched ones, we also find that even with this extreme enrichment, these two, our average and our low fractionation scenarios, do reproduce values, do give us values within our African rainfall range. So with that, I just want to conclude our triple auction isotopes for you. You may not need them, but I think for certain settings, for certain archives, it may be very important to help really get some clear interpretations of your hydroclimate records. And what we found at Localized is this is absolutely the case. By really constraining the local evaporative forcing, we can begin to better interpret what the original hydroclimate signal may be over the site, and by removing that local kind of evaporative forcing signal. And so just quickly, just next steps for this is developing a systematic method for applying these findings to our entire carbonate auction isotopic record, because we can't do these analysis at the moment on the entire core. So with that, I just want to thank colleagues and funding support and open it up for questions. Thank you.
Okay, in this talk I'm going to be dwelling on the problem of whether we can reconcile evidence for the nature of subtropical precipitation or precipitation in subtropical latitudes in the past, during warm climates, warmer than Holocene climates in the past, and in the geologically immediate future. So to start with, so we've got basically, here's a summary from IPCC, from AR5. Basically shows that in a range of representative concentration pathways, doesn't really matter, they just warm different amounts, depending on assumptions in the future, as climates warm in the future, that globally, global average precipitation increases more or less, but basically it's a very simple relationship there. But that in contrast to that, in both the northern and southern hemispheres, if we look at the subtropical latitudes, there's a very well-known contradiction to that global pattern, which is that the subtropics gets drier as the globe as a whole gets wetter. So we can see that pretty clearly in the southern hemisphere. So basically what we have here is northern hemisphere winter and southern hemisphere winters, and they're basically in the cool seasons in particular. In each hemisphere we get a drying relative to the pre-industrial in a lot of these regions, particularly on west coasts in the subtropics, and we get this kind of pattern also in the Mediterranean and other subtropical regions in the northern hemisphere in their wet season. So there's been a lot of debate about what drives that, whether it's thermodynamic or dynamic processes, and it remains an area of active research, but it's an area of big concern because at least out to the time frames that most people have looked at, which is mostly just to the year 2100, it's a fairly consistent signal that the subtropics are getting drier. So this has often been considered like a rich get richer, poor get poorer kind of problem, that the wet places on Earth get wetter and the dry places get drier. So if that's the case for the future, for future warming, the obvious question, as in the paleo community ought to be, and for the future modeling community ought to be, when we look at examples in Earth's past, was the Pliocene, which is broadly accepted as one of the more useful analogs for future warming, were the subtropical regions dry in the past? Well, the answer seems to be no. So this is a compilation from Ulrich Salzmann of pollen-based precipitation reconstructions from all sorts of regions, and I've put in bold some of those that are broadly could be called subtropical latitudes, and we basically see that all of these comparisons between modern rainfall and Pliocene rainfall are all wetter. They're wetter everywhere, including in the subtropical regions, with just one anomaly in Yunnan, which could be to do with the very high uncertainty around the modern climate in that region. And so generally it looks like the proxies are suggesting, despite their substantial uncertainties, suggesting that it was wetter everywhere in the Pliocene, in warm climates. And from modeling approaches, here's some work of Chris Brierley's, the present day, so this is precipitation in the present day versus in the Pliocene, and we see that basically he's got dry regions are lavenders to purples, and those lavender to purples get wetter in the Pliocene, particularly in the southern hemisphere subtropics, but also in the northern hemisphere subtropics, and conversely, all of these areas of, like in the West Pacific warm pool, of all this ITCZ areas of the highest precipitation on Earth today virtually disappear in the Pliocene. So some very different things going on in the Pliocene. If anything, the models are suggesting the Pliocene was wet in the subtropics. So the trouble with that sort of data is that most of the pollen data that's based on are just essentially snapshots in time. And so we wanted to know how subtropical precipitation evolved over time as temperatures evolved over time during the Pliocene. So our focal area here is the Nullarbor Plain, which is an enormous low altitude subtropical limestone plateau covered in basically fossil caves. It's too dry in this region today to actually form caves or to really form significant speleothems because it rains only about 250 millimeters a year there now. And these little dots here are all different caves that we have collected speleothems in. And basically, the approach we've taken is to, and this is what the region looks like today, it's basically saltbush plain with occasionally some scattered trees. But inside those caves, there's large numbers of speleothems. So the new data here that I'm presenting today is these 112 uranium-lead age determinations on individual speleothems with their 2 sigma age uncertainties, and these are mostly well beyond the range of uranium-thorium, so that's why our lab developed uranium-lead dating to actually try to put age constraints on these old speleothems. And this is basically their distribution, and this is basically a kernel density estimate, which is like a probability density function of which is like infinitely thin histogram showing infinitely thin binned histogram showing the timing of greatest growth. And so you can see a pretty clear pattern here that back here in the late Miocene there was relatively little speleothem growth, and that speleothem growth really picked up as we moved into the Pliocene and peaked at about 3.4 million years before crashing quite precipitously. And that seems to relate very nicely to this regional sea surface temperature record, which comes from here off the northwest of Australia in the subtropics here, of a relatively cool late Miocene and warming quite abruptly at about 5 million or so, and a sustained warming until about 3.4 million when this record crashes and becomes cooler. And we can see sort of a perpetuation of that cooling pattern in this younger record here from ODP 1090, which is down here south of Africa. You might ask why I don't use more records here. There's not that many sea surface temperature records that span this whole period. So you might then say this slope here downward could just be an artifact. As the caves get older, it's likely the speleothems are lost, so maybe we just can't find enough of them. But these pollen-derived precipitation estimates, which are also from the Nullarbor caves that we reconstructed, suggest that it was very dry. Here's the modern rainfall today. It was a bit wetter than today. And then at about 5 million years, it got 2, 3, 4 times wetter than that and sustained forests there for 1.5 million years or so before, the record disappears and we can't recover any pollen from any of these younger speleothems, suggesting that it had dried out quite a lot. And then this general pattern is supported by these subantarctic biogenic opal records that suggest it was relatively cool and got warmer from the late Miocene to the Pliocene. And there's an emerging story here, particularly with this new CO2 record by Stock et al., that finally put this data point here and bridged between all these Pliocene CO2 reconstructions and Pagani's now quite old CO2 reconstruction here that suggests that maybe there is an increase in CO2 as we move from the late Miocene into the Pliocene that may explain Pliocene warmth, even though it's been very difficult actually really to explain it. So what this is showing is there's a simple relationship. Southern hemisphere warming, we get more speleothem growth, presumably it was wetter. Southern hemisphere cooling, we get less speleothem growth, presumably it was drier. So then let's look at future climate and what that says about that. Okay, so initially there seems to be a contradiction here with a wet, warm past and a dry, warm future in the subtropics. So one of the things we wanted to take advantage of was the fact that there are these extended RCPs. Most people overwhelmingly have just looked out in the CMIP5 projections out to the year 2100, but they exist out to 2300. The scenarios do. Hardly anyone's taken advantage of these, and many groups, a subset of all the CMIP5 community, have run these runs out to the year 2300. We looked at two of these RCPs, 4.5 and 8.5. They differ. This shows how they differ. These are just their CO2, their radiative forcing prescriptions. And in RCP 4.5, it's basically a stabilization scenario. So we get a rapid rising of CO2 to about 500, it's this line here, 550 ppm of CO2, and it stabilizes for 2 centuries, whereas RCP 8.5 is this business as usual, horrible PETM sort of world of 2,000 ppm CO2, and there's a bit of stabilization just at the end of the scenario. So here you can see this is the rate of change of forcing. In the 4.5 it stabilizes, and this one is really just slowing down, but it doesn't stabilize till the end. So they're quite different scenarios, and we looked at both of those, and we basically wanted to look at subtropical southern hemisphere precipitation. So we defined that in this latitudinal band, and we went looking at the zonal mean subtropical precipitation in these two RCPs and compared those to each other. And so what we've got here is plotted on timescales, ECP 4.5. There were 16 models that have done that, and in ECP, or RCP, sorry, I moved back and forth between these terminologies. RCP 8.5, 9 modeling groups produced that, and these are the temperatures relative to modern reference period. And in blue we have winter rainfall, and in green we have summer rainfall, and you can see this familiar subtropical drying happening. The y-axes in these two are quite different because there's so much stronger forcing. The rainfall decline is even greater. But you get the familiar drying in the subtropics out to the year 2100, but soon after 2100 we actually get a recovery that no one has really noticed because no one has looked beyond 2100. And we get at least here, if not a recovery, at least the trends don't continue to get drier. And in summer rainfall we basically just get wetting trends from today. They're just getting wetter. It's just that to the year 2100, these are really difficult to separate from the noise, and the signal just gets clearer and clearer as we move out a couple more centuries. So that's interesting. We wanted to see whether that continues beyond 2300, and we have colleagues in Canada who provided us with this data, which is an idealized simulation that involved rapidly increasing CO2 to 2100, followed by stabilization until the year 3000, and this is just global temperature. And this is southern hemisphere subtropical precipitation in winter and summer, showing a similar pattern of decline in rainfall of actually both seasons, followed by just continual but rather weak increasing trends continuing well beyond 2300 and continuing out. So this pattern is reasonably robust. So then to try to explain this and provide a mechanism for it, we drew on some previous observations that in the southern hemisphere, it's quite different from the northern hemisphere, the subtropical winter drying seems to be linked to the southern hemisphere meridional temperature gradient, which we've defined here as the difference between 0 to 20 degrees south minus 50 to 70 degrees south. And what we basically did was try to see whether we could see a pattern, a link between the patterns of rainfall changes and changes in that meridional temperature gradient over time. So basically what we've done is we plotted the two RCPs, 4.5 and 8.5, in 3 different centuries, 21st, 22nd, 23rd century. And here is basically whether the meridional temperature gradient is getting steeper. In other words, whether there's going to be whether the tropics are getting ahead of the high latitudes, or whether the high latitudes are finally catching up with them. And basically what this shows is that in both of these scenarios, we get in winter, these blue dots, we get a very clear pattern in which we've got drying, because this is change in rainfall. So these are just linear trends for each century. I didn't say that. We get basically the drying also associated with increases in the steepening of the meridional temperature gradient. And then in RCP 4.5, we get CO2 stabilization, which presumably is related to global temperature stabilization, and we get a shift where the meridional temperature gradient is no longer steepening, it's shallowing, and there's a bit of ambiguity about whether it's getting wetter, but it certainly stops getting so dry. In RCP 8.5, which is much stronger forcing, but where stabilization is delayed until after 2200, we get a bit of a mess happening here in the 22nd century, but by the 23rd century, we get a situation where the meridional temperature gradient is no longer steepening, it's now shallowing again, and in all of the models, winter rainfall is now increasing again. And in contrast to that, in summer, these orange dots, there's no pattern, there's no relationship with the meridional temperature gradient. And over here in the CAN ESM1 simulation that went out to the year 3000, we get a similar shift from this 21st century pattern over into this pattern here for after temperatures have stabilized. Okay, so to conclude all that, basically, what we find is that in the current generation CMIT-5 GCMs, even though they lack dynamic ice sheets and all sorts of things that you might think are part of Earth system feedbacks and that are all represented in a Pliocene sort of climate, Southern Hemisphere subtropical winter drying trends either cease or reverse. They start reversing, and apparently that's linked to the timing of the stabilization of global temperatures driven through the scenarios of CO2 emissions. And presumably the mechanism of this is Southern Hemisphere. In the Southern Hemisphere is the Southern Hemisphere meridional temperature gradient that influences the latitude of winter storm tracks, and that in contrast to the behavior of winter precipitation, summer precipitation just basically is rising from today and continuing to rise over coming centuries in response to global warming. And basically higher precipitation in both the past warm climates and the stabilized future imply that 21st century subtropical drying that we experience and that we anticipate over coming decades to century or so is a transient feature and is effectively under our control and is sensitive to the timing at which we cease CO2 emissions, basically. And so effectively is a transient feature. And that in the long run, we're more likely to see a pattern like this, which is the nullarbor relationship, where we have basically got, starting at 6 million years, increasing up the y-axis here, increasing amount of speleothem growth as temperatures in that ODP 763 record increase, and then as the ODP 763 record starts cooling at 3.4 million, we have declining speleothem growth. So I guess the take-home message here of that is that in the long term, it seems like subtropics, like everywhere else on the planet, will get wetter, ultimately, as temperatures rise and we're left with a stable, warm world over subsequent centuries and millennia. Thank you. That's all I've got.
Would you, if you had the ability to detect it, would you expect to see in the onset of Pliocene wetting a transient decline in rainfall, or is it simply the rate of change is so slow that the rate of change in the modern world is so quickly that's the cause of the transient drying?
Well, if we can see a change, I assume that since we can see a change really, we were surprised at how fast we can see that the models in just to the year 20, just in 3 centuries, could pick up a difference of stabilizing CO2. So that seems like you need an amazingly transient. The whole system is responding so quickly. It's unlikely that anything in the geological record would. Certainly, that early Pliocene warming, which looks like it happened over hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. So I don't expect to see this. But in the PETM, some people have argued that the PETM was fast enough to see these effects in North America. People have argued that there's drying associated with the very rapid warming of the PETM at the end, Paleocene, Eocene thing. But how fast does that need to be? I don't know.
Great. So yes, thanks very much for setting me up so nicely, Kale, with that talk. So I'll be taking a look at very much the same narrative. So just to get everyone on the same page, we're going back into the Pliocene, and the Pliocene is of particular interest to us because of the fact that it's sort of we've got this nice result, ice core records for CO2. Then the estimates get more uncertain, but even with some more recent higher resolution estimates, we're sort of putting ourselves close to the 400 parts per million world, anywhere between 350 and 450 ppm. And then when we look at the sort of proxy data to reconstruct what was happening in terms of the hydrological cycle, there's some more direct records. Kale gave an example for Southern Australia. But the sort of broad picture that comes across is that we had wetter subtropics on all the continents. And the first time I sort of went to an AGU session and I sat in the modern session and everyone was talking about tropical drying with climate change, and then I went to the paleoclimate session, everyone was saying this Pliocene 400 ppm analog world was wetter subtropics. I sort of said, how can we reconcile this fundamental difference that we're seeing here for a higher CO2 world? And the other thing that we have to sort of take into account about
what characterized the Pliocene is, so here we have two syntheses papers, one that actually goes with a lot of the records that go all the way back to the Miocene. And you can see they're taking records from a bunch of sites covering the globe, and some are coming from tropical sites, warm pool sites, cold tongue, subtropical upwelling sites, and usually there is a mixture of proxy records that go into these. But one of the salient features that comes across is that in general we're seeing polar amplified warming, such that the warming in the sort of high to mid latitudes and even in the subtropics, the sort of some subtropical sites, is much more amplified relative to what's happening in the tropics in the warm pool. Obviously, there is some debate with the warm pool and the various proxy methods, but all things considered, maybe around 1 degree of warming in the warm pool. When you contrast this to sort of 4 to 5 degrees of warming in the cold tongue. So in general, reduced both meridional and zonal temperature gradients in the Pliocene. And so, in general, when you force GCMs with the reconstructed Pliocene boundary conditions and the sort of higher elevated 400 ppm CO2, they've struggled to capture the full extent of the reductions of gradients, of Pliocene gradients. So what we did is we sort of reversed engineered the problem. We said to ourselves, okay, how do we get at a world with gradients similar to the Pliocene? And we did this in a rather crude manner. We took CSM and we sort of talked about it theoretically, and we said, well, a world without a strong cold tongue is a world where the ocean transports less heat polewards. And in order to transport less heat polewards as the ocean, and if you assume sort of equal partitioning between the atmosphere and the ocean, there's some theoretical arguments for that as well, you'd really have to change top of atmosphere required poleward heat transport of the fully coupled system. So this would be a world with reduced equator to pole heat transport, particularly by the subtropical cells. And so really changes in cloud radiative forcing is the mechanism you would have to invoke. And as I said, we did this very crudely. We didn't necessarily invoke aerosol changes or cloud feedback changes, but those would be the hypothetical mechanisms behind it. What we did is we just said any time a cloud forms in our GCM, this is a fully coupled simulation, polewards of 15 north and 15 south, let's make it more reflective or less reflective to shortwave radiation. So we just did this in the shortwave radiation scheme. And we did it at first we only did it in the extratropics. We both increased extratropical albedo and decreased extratropical albedo. We also did some compensating changes in the tropics. And then we played around with the boundaries just to test the sensitivity of our results to changing boundaries. And then we also complemented these with some higher resolution runs, just to model a subset with higher resolution model, so a different model essentially. And we also did some 2 times, 4 times, 8 times, and 16 times CO2 simulations. And then what we did is, in this talk, I'm going to focus on cherry picking. I'm going to show you results from all of these. I'm going to show you relationships based on all of these simulations. But for the Pliocene-like simulation, we cherry-picked it based on agreement with the data. And for the 4 times CO2, we're just using this as a complement, just to complement or sort of compare our Pliocene-like simulation to in terms of a direct radiative forcing response. Okay, so this is the 2 experiments. So this is our 4 times CO2 experiment. It's about 560 parts per million. And this is our Pliocene minus control for SST change for what we cherry-picked as being our Pliocene-like simulation. And so by Pliocene-like, you can see some distinctions here. We have moderate, between 0 to 1 degree of warming in the warm pool compared to the sort of 2 to 3 degrees that we have. Okay, obviously this is not a 400 ppm experiment. This is a 560 ppm experiment, so we're getting more warming here. But the take-home message is that this is sort of while there is some polar amplified warming, it's nothing nearly to the extent that we're getting in the Pliocene record, where we have good agreement with the proxy data in terms of the spatial warming, for example, even in the North Atlantic here, capturing the warming there. So what does this look like from a zonal mean perspective? Well, this is our control. So this is our zonal mean sea surface temperatures in the control. And this is our zonal mean precipitation minus evaporation in the control. So dry subtropics, wet tropics, and mid-latitudes. So what the 4 times 2 CO experiment does is it uniformly warms. So while you do have some polar amplified warming, your tropics are warming as well. Contrast this with our Pliocene-like simulation. So one of the things that you see that you have this sort of expanded warm pool, and it's not increasing as much as in the CO2 experiments. So you kind of have a reduced meridional temperature gradient. And in particular for this talk, it's this gradient between the subtropics and the tropics. So sort of between 50 or 40 north and south, and then the tropical region. And the key difference here is if you look in the subtropics between these two experiments, you see that the subtropics get wetter in our Pliocene-like experiments, unlike the 4 times CO2 experiment where we actually have subtropical drying with a P-E change. So I just wanted to quickly put this slide in for those of you who are thinking about these things. This is the mean response, and this is the eddy response. And you can see that most of the changes in the subtropical moisture transport is happening because of, so the tropical moisture transport in the mean is responsible for this change in moisture divergence from the tropics, rather than the eddy part, which is more important. And actually both models look fairly similar for mid to high latitude changes in moisture transport. So it's really the fact that we have reduced gradients between the tropics and the subtropics that are factoring into changing the Hadley strength, and as a result, changing the moisture transport. So just to break this down for you, when we think about P-E, in a steady state, when you're thinking about it from a steady state perspective, it has to be balanced by moisture convergence, right? So if you now have a region which has less precipitation than evaporation, you obviously have less moisture convergence into that region. And so when we think about the typical wet gets wetter, dry gets drier scenario, this is based on the assumption that the circulation strength doesn't change that much, but it's really the fact that we have an increase in specific humidity as the world warms. And so because the world warms, now your Hadley cell, for example, is evaporating more water in the subtropics and transporting it more efficiently to the tropics because it can hold more water vapor, right? But on the other end of the story, and we assume that there's not too much change in Hadley strength in our global warming experiments. And we don't see that much change in global warming experiments because the meridional temperature gradient doesn't change that much. But in our Pliocene-like experiment, the meridional gradient does change. And so in this term, we're talking about changes in the strength of the Hadley circulation. And what this does is this is actually a counteracting term. So here we can compare our 4 times CO2 experiments against our Pliocene-like experiment. And what you see is that so we've decomposed it into changes in circulation versus changes in specific humidity versus the eddy term. And really the changes in specific humidity is what's dominating to increase the efficiency of the moisture transport from the subtropics to the tropics in the zonal mean. Whereas in the Pliocene, you have this to some extent because of just the warming and the fact that a warmer atmosphere can hold more water vapor. But then you have this counteracting effect of the fact that you've changed the circulation strength because you've weakened the strength of the Hadley circulation. So it's just a sort of who wins in this battle between these two terms. And this is just to illustrate for you the difference in Hadley strength. So this is the Hadley strength in our control simulation, the 4 times CO2. So you see not that much of a change versus the weakening of the Hadley circulation in our Pliocene-like experiment. And just to sort of hammer home this message that we have to think not only about the climate sensitivity, but we also have to think about what I'm calling the structural climate sensitivity in terms of the changes in the strength of the magnitude of these gradients. And Kale kind of illustrated that nicely, talking about the meridional gradients in the southern hemisphere, and I was sort of surprised that that's emerged out of your work as well. So here what we have is the P-E in the subtropics, averaged across the subtropics, as a function of global mean temperature across all the experiments that we ran, including the CO2 experiments. And then here we have P-E as a function of the meridional temperature gradient. And as you can see, in both cases, there's no strong agreement. But if we separate out the component of the moisture transport, which translates into a P-E change, right, because we're assuming in the steady state that these two variables are balanced, you can see that the component due to changes in specific humidity are very much related to global mean temperature, and the changes related to circulation strength, so the second term that I showed you, are quite tightly related to the strength of the meridional gradient. So we have these competing effects, and so models that have more of a weakening in their gradient will have less of a drying in the subtropics. And so this sort of just summarizes this concept in the sense that in the 4 times CO2 experiment, because we have less of a weakening of the meridional temperature gradient, the sort of the change in specific humidity dominates, and we have wet gets wetter, dry gets drier, as opposed to in our Pliocene experiment where we had changes in circulation dominating, and we have wettening of the subtropics. I don't know how I'm doing for time. This is just a comparison of P minus C between our 4 times CO2 experiment and then the various sort of reconstructions that we have for wetter subtropics around the globe. Great. So just to summarize, the broad features of the Pliocene hydrological cycle appear to be different from the typical greenhouse gas scenario. This is related to reduced meridional zonal temperature gradients during the Pliocene, sustaining weaker Hadley and Walker circulations. The weaker atmospheric circulation tends to lead to reduction of the moisture transport in the low and subtropical latitudes during the Pliocene, whereas the moisture transport increases in our CO2 experiment. This brings me to how we got there. We got there with changing clouds, or cloud radiative properties and albedo, and that sort of begs the question, if we were to try to get there realistically, would we be relying on an unresolved cloud feedback to CO2, or could we, for example, take a CMIP5 model that has a really high low cloud, stratus cloud feedback, a positive cloud feedback? Would that give us a better Pliocene-like response to CO2 and a bit of a negative feedback in the tropics of some kind, maybe a sort of a tropical drying due to convective aggregation that's not really simulated by these models at this point? Or was there something very different about the aerosol forcing of the Pliocene? And I think that's an important question to address before we can say that it is appropriate analog. And so just the other thing, which is sort of more relevant to future climate, is sort of thinking about this idea of not only focusing on the climate sensitivity per se, but also the structural climate sensitivity. So how are the meridional temperature gradients changing? Thanks.
We're going to end the day back in the tropical Pacific, looking at records from this large lake situated on the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia. This is a sort of large collaborative project involving collection of seismic reflection data, piston cores, as well as very long drill cores to try to constrain the hydroclimate of the Western Pacific over multiple glacial interglacial cycles. For this talk, I'd like to particularly thank a set of students and postdocs who have worked with me at Brown over the years and generated a lot of the data. Okay, so Western Pacific, the tropical Western Pacific hosts the highest rates of rainfall anywhere on Earth, more or less. However, when we look at seasonal patterns of precipitation in this region, it's enormously spatially complicated. Right? There's a lot of heterogeneity here. That heterogeneity is partly expected given the complexity of this atmospheric circulation systems that cause this rainfall variability. Migration of the ITCZ, both summer and winter Asian monsoons, as well as ENSO are responsible for this complexity. On longer timescales, similarly, there are a number of different hypotheses and forcings that have been put out in the literature to try to explain rainfall variations in the past. This ranges from both local and subtropical insolation forcing to ice volume forcing. Bronwen earlier spelled out the importance of sea level change, which results in the exposure of the Sunda shelf, this broad area of shallow water here. So what we really wanted to do was to generate a long record spanning multiple glacial interglacials situated here to try to test how these forcings play out in time. Just noting where this is Lake Tweedy. It's situated in a part of the warm pool that receives about 3 meters of rainfall a year with a slight bias towards winter. The lake itself is situated, be careful with those buttons there. The lake itself is situated along a strike-slip fault. It's about a 500 square kilometer lake that is at the terminal end of the Molili Lakes. It receives upstream overflow from the upstream lakes. Seismic reflection data have documented on the order of 100 meters of stratified sediment, which overlies another 50 meters of more poorly stratified sediment. Over the years, we recovered a whole series of different seismic reflection data sets, initially 10-meter piston cores that spanned the last 60,000 years, in which I'm going to start by describing, and then just about a year and a half ago, we drilled all the way down to bedrock there to try to analyze these long records. Okay, one of the first records we generated from this lake was a record of the carbon isotopic composition of leaf waxes. These are waxes that are essentially the skin of these leaves, and their carbon isotopic composition in this setting records the abundance of C3 versus C4 vegetation on the landscape, with more depleted values indicating closed canopy forests and more enriched values indicating more open vegetation types, i.e. wetter, drier. And what immediately jumps out at you is a very large oscillation, actually very large oscillation during the last glacial. That during the Holocene and marine isotope stage 3, we observe closed canopy forest. During the last glacial, we observe isotopic compositions consistent with more open forests or even grasslands. Generally, when we look at speleothem records, and in fact some other records from this region, going from north Hulu Cave down to south Flores, these are oxygen isotope records, so do take them with a grain of salt in inferring precipitation. However, these have generally been interpreted to reflect the importance of local insulation on the hydrological cycle of these different sites. Going from Hulu, where we see a strong influence of northern hemisphere precession, down to Flores Cave, where we see a strong influence of insulation during austral summer. When we try this game at Lake Tahuti, it just looks like a mess, right? Especially during the last ice age, if we look at the relationship between drying and local insulation, large offsets. We try to look at other forcings. This is a plot of the exposure history of the Sunda and Sahul shelves versus the carbon isotopic composition here. And certainly there's much better agreement during the glacial. The shelf was exposed, it's dry. However, here we create a large problem during marine isotope stage 3. So we certainly can't explain the wet MIS3 values we see here with shelf exposure. So we've generally turned to the influence of the ice sheets themselves and their effects on global temperature as well as atmospheric heat and vapor transport to explain this signal, in that we see the best correlation between ice volume and moisture balance here. So what I'm going to try to do with the remaining time is look at a series of questions. First, the record you're looking here at is a record of vegetation. And vegetation certainly has many non-linearities in how it responds to climate. So can we measure other things that more or less confirm the hydrologic history? We are getting a signal that differs from models. It differs from other records in the indication of lack of influence of the Sunda-Sahul shelf exposure on the site. So is that realistic? We'll visit that a bit. And then we're going to try to look at some of the longer records we're generating and more suborbital variations recorded in those. Okay, so for starters, I don't have time to go through every single one of these, but suffice it to say that basically everything that we have ever measured from these cores looks more or less the same way, right? All of these proxies indicate drying during the last ice age, with the largest perturbations between about 20 and 30,000 years before the present. We've been able to link this package of sediment to an acoustically highly reflective sediment package in seismic reflection data, which is overlain by acoustically transparent sediment, recording a low stand, lake level lowering during the last ice age, with this being the glacial sediment, this being the Holocene sediment. We estimate that low stand based on erosional truncation and other features at about 25 meters below the present level. Now, Tahuti today it's a dammed site, and by that I mean hydrologically dammed. And so this is used for power generation, and as a function of this, there's been a ton of hydrologic monitoring as well as weather monitoring to ensure consistent power generation. That gives us the opportunity. We've installed lake temperature monitors and other things. All of this gives us the opportunity to construct lake level models to try to reconstruct quantitatively how precipitation in the warm pool varied during this LGM drying. We don't have the variables we would need to solve for evaporation during the last ice age. However, if we vary evaporation rate and calculate the degree of precipitation reduction, or the percentage, the LGM precipitation relative to modern as a function of evaporation, we record anything on the order of about a 40% reduction in precipitation to a 70% reduction in precipitation, depending on how you want to treat evaporation. It's big. It's very, very dry climate. And that's quite interesting, going back to the Sunda Shelf question. You're looking here at a set of PMIP models. This is from D'Ignazio and Tierney, in which they were investigating the influence of soon-to-shelf exposure on regional climate. In terms of amplitude, the drying over this region, over the warm pool, doesn't really come that close to what we observe in proxy data. However, what we note is only the models that are most sensitive to soon-to-shelf exposures, such as Hadley, which is right there. Only the models most sensitive to soon-to-shelf exposure come close to predicting 50%, 60% reductions in precipitation over this region. So we conclude from that that shelf exposure amplifies the extent of LGM drying, but shelf exposure alone is not enough to impose a dry climate on this region. You really need the combination of glacial LGM boundary conditions, low CO2 insulation, as well as shelf exposure to explain what's observed in that region. Okay, so Lake Tweedy sits in an ophiolite, and by virtue of that, it receives a lot of fairly unique minerals coming into it. Among those are highly magnesium-rich serpentine clays that are derived from laerzolites that are exposed mostly in the northern part of the catchment. These are distributed primarily in a very large delta that is formed by the upstream flow into the lake. This is a map of the composition or the percentage of magnesium and percentage of serpentine in sediments. What we're going to do is use the magnesium and serpentine content to record forced progradation of this delta under lake low stands. Essentially what happens is that when the water level in Tweedy drops, this delta builds outward, and these magnesium and serpentine-rich sediments extend much farther out into the lake. This is the serpentine to kaolinite ratio. This is the percent magnesium. What we observe when we look at this is not only do we observe generally lower lake levels during the last glacial, but we also see a series of suborbital fluctuations in the magnesium content and in serpentine content. These also show up actually in iron-titanium ratios, percent carbonate mineral abundances. So we see a set of oscillations here, 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 all recorded in all of these proxies. If we try to link these to insulation forcing, we actually observe a fairly interesting relationship. We observe low stand conditions during both fall and spring equinoxes. That is when March and September insulation forcing at the equator is maximized. That is, in essence, a split precessional signal linked to the vernal and spring equinox, or the spring and fall equinoxes. That's also quite interesting. Others have observed exactly the opposite. For instance, the Borneo Delta 018 record of Kim Cobb's group, Stacy Caroline's work, which is situated right there, gets more or less the opposite interpretation, in which the most Delta 018 or 018 depleted compositions are associated with peaks in fall insolation. We, in contrast, observe drying during fall insolation. Now, opposite responses of Borneo and Sulawesi aren't necessarily unexpected if we look at the correlation of interannual precipitation anomalies of Lake Tweedy to the region today. Indeed, Borneo is antiphased with Sulawesi, and so it doesn't take too much imagination that we would observe something like this. And yet it is a bit unsettling that two proxy records located fairly close together can wind up with essentially the opposing responses to insulation forcing at the equator. And so what might drive this? One idea that we've been playing around with, mostly by looking at simulations from Syntrace, is that insulation forcing during these seasons drives changes in the Walker circulation. This is, in fact, already hypothesized for September, October, November insulation forcing by Caroline to explain the Borneo record. And the basic idea here is that strong insulation at 6K strengthens the monsoon, and that sets up a stronger Walker. If we look at, so you're looking here at precipitation anomalies during SON and during March, April, May at 6,000 years ago and 18,000 years ago. And indeed, we do see some evidence for antiphasing over the warm pool during this region with generally drier conditions. seasonally over the eastern Pacific, wetter conditions over the western tropical Pacific. But I don't think we fully understand what's actually driving these, and that if we look at wind field anomalies, they are opposite. So we can actually get generally similar precipitation patterns via completely opposing insulation forcing. Okay, so all of this, this is all what we get from 60,000 years. What do we get when we look just a little bit deeper? So I should say all of this is very, very new data. I got this age model about a week ago, something like that. So in 2015, we drilled a 150-meter long sediment core from Lake Tahuti. It consists of a variety of different lithologies, the upper 100 meters of which are generally fine-grained, continuously deposited lake sediment. They alternate between red and green, with high susceptibility units generally being red. These are our dries. The green units, these are reducing clays. Our preliminary age model, which is based on paleomag as well as radiocarbon in the very top, indicates that the transition between this much more complex sediment, which records the initial tectonic opening of the basin, and the overlying lake clay dates to about 600,000. So we have about a 600 kiloyear continuous record here. Interestingly, if we look at the same thing we saw earlier, our record of lake low stands recorded in magnesium, this time measured by core scanning XRF data, and I'm not going to go through this too much. One thing that jumps out at you immediately looking at the percent magnesium variations is that unlike the last 60,000 years, we really do not see a very strong ice volume signal. That is, the LGM may actually be quite unique, and I think this may speak to the complexity of interacting forcings that may be required to drive strong drying in the warm pool during the last ice age. It's not just shelf exposure, it's not just insulation, it's not just ice volume, it's all of those and how they're interacting. What we do see, however, if we do a time series spectral analysis on this data, is relatively strong precession as well as relatively strong hemiprecession, that is this 11,000-year cycle. And so that seems to be a fairly continuous feature of much of the last 600,000 years in this region. That 16 kiloyear thing, that's a heterodyne of the other two. Okay. So I'll stop there. What I would say, during the last glacial maximum, we observed strong drying over the warm pool in association with both shelf exposure as well as glacial, sort of all glacial boundary conditions. Dry conditions occur as well during spring and fall perihelia, which we attribute to zonal changes in precipitation. The 600,000-year records, however, suggest precession and hemiprecession dominate the orbital scale variability. And I think what we're really learning from this is that actually, in many cases, the precipitation changes over the warm pool are very, very heterogeneous, both in space and time. We see that playing out when we compare our records to the Borneo records. We see that playing out in time, given the importance of different forcings in time. And so I think I will stop there, actually.
How do you develop a paleomag record that goes from 0 to 600,000 years? What event did you record?
So that's, I should have said, that's magnetic paleo intensity. And so the upper event is La Champ, and it's sort of working its way backwards through those. The sediments here have incredibly high susceptibility, such that those events are recorded very cleanly, and that's because of the ophiolite bedrock. There's just an enormous amount of magnetite coming in. So.